The heat in Pine Hollow, Georgia, clung to your skin like wet linen in the summer of 1983. The air smelled of magnolia, diesel, and something else, something heavy. Folks kept their windows open and their radios louder, hoping the gospel would chase away whatever shadows the heat brought in. But no one expected that Sunday evening would be the last time anyone saw Reverend Elijah Harmon alive. He wasn't just the pastor of Greater Rock Baptist Church. He was the conscience of Pine Hollow, a man whose deep voice could command silence or stir tears with just a single line of scripture. He had been the first black man in town to preach both in white and black churches, a miracle in itself. He stood tall, always in his signature navy suit and polished brown shoes, and when he walked through the town square, people noticed. Not just because of his presence, but because of what he represented. Hope, healing, and something many didn't want to name out loud, change. But on July 10th, 1983, everything changed. That morning, Reverend Harmon delivered a sermon that stopped hearts cold. Gone were the warm metaphors of mustard seeds and prodigal sons. This message was different, urgent, dark. He spoke of liars in holy robes, of secrets buried under crosses. The Lord knows what happens behind closed door, he thundered, but I've seen it with my own eyes, and judgment comes not from above, but from within the flock. The sanctuary, packed as always, sat frozen. Deacon Samuel Pike looked pale. Sheriff Joel Mathers, who attended with his wife on occasion, left halfway through. And Clara Harmon, Elijah's wife, sat in the front pew, her hand clutching her Bible so tightly her knuckles turned white. After the service, Elijah told Clara he'd stay behind to write out the sermon notes more clearly, said he had some calls to make. That was the last conversation they ever had. Hours passed. Then the sun began to fall behind the trees. Still no sign of Elijah. His pickup truck was found just after 7 p.m., parked behind the church where he always left it. The door was unlocked. The keys were in the ignition. His worn leather Bible sat on the pulpit, open to the book of Amos. Beside it was a folded note titled for Clara, but the paper was blank. No ink, just indentations, as if someone had written with a dead pen or changed their mind halfway through. One detail stood out. His white handkerchief lay nearby, faintly stained at the edges with something reddish-brown. The scent of copper lingered faintly in the air. That night, Clara sat on the front porch with the phone in her lap, dialing numbers. Friends, church elders, the hospital, the sheriff. No one had seen him. No one knew where he had gone. By dawn, the town was divided. Some believed he had simply walked away, burned out, or broken. Others whispered about foul play. Some claimed they'd seen unfamiliar vehicles in town. A few pointed fingers at powerful men Elijah had criticized from the pulpit. But Clara knew better. Her husband was a man of conviction, not cowardice. He wouldn't vanish without a reason. And if someone had silenced him, then she would make sure they never got to bury the truth. The sheriff's office launched an investigation. Search parties were formed. Helicopters scoured the nearby forest. Dogs were brought in. Divers combed nearby creeks. Elijah's face was plastered on every telephone pole from Pine Hollow to Atlanta. Church members opened their homes to search teams. News crews showed up. For a few weeks, Pine Hollow felt like the center of the world. But after a month with no leads, no suspects, and no body, the fire began to die down. Then something odd happened. Deputy Alan Bristow, a quiet young man with a clean record and a soft spot for Clara, suddenly requested a transfer. No public reason. Just packed up, left town, and didn't come back. The official word? Family matters. But those who'd known Alan best said he seemed haunted. He didn't say goodbye to anyone, not even the friends he'd known since childhood. As the years wore on, Clara never stopped asking questions. She started keeping a journal of everything: witness statements, rumors, patterns, and behavior. She noticed things others missed. Who stopped showing up to church? Who refused to talk about that Sunday? And who suddenly came into money, land, or silence? She contacted civil rights groups, hired private investigators, even appeared on a regional TV program in 1991 pleading for help. But without new evidence, no one could do much. Her once bold voice started to sound weary. Her steps grew slower. But she still sat in the second pew every Sunday, never the first, never Elijah's seat. Every July 10th, Clara lit a candle at the steps of Greater Rock Baptist Church. And for 29 years, she stood alone under the stars, whispering his name. And then on a quiet October morning in 2012, fate moved again. Donnie Clayton, a local logger, was clearing brush land behind the now abandoned Harmon Church. The land had changed hands. Developers wanted to put in luxury cabins. Donnie's chainsaw jammed in a thick tree stump. Irritated, he knelt down and started digging. And that's when he hit something metal. The box was buried deep, wedged in the tangled roots of a long-dead tree stump. Rust had eaten away at its hinges, and the top was dented like it had been struck with something heavy. Donnie Clayton, the logger who discovered it, wasn't the curious type. He planned to toss it aside, but something about the weight and the glint of something white beneath the rust made him stop. He pried it open with a crowbar and nearly dropped it when he saw what was inside. A blood-stained handkerchief with the initials E.H., a gold wedding ring engraved with the words, "Ever yours, C.H., and an old audio cassette labeled only one word, "Testament." Donnie didn't waste time. He called the sheriff's office, and within an hour the property was cordoned off with yellow tape. Investigators in white suits combed the area, while Clara, now 81 years old, was driven to the site by a young deputy who could barely make eye contact with her. She stood there in the clearing, looking down at the earth as if expecting Elijah's voice to rise up from the soil. Is that his?" she asked quietly, her gaze fixed on the handkerchief inside the evidence bag. No one answered, but she already knew. News spread fast. The local papers lit up. A pastor who vanished without a trace in 1983, now possibly linked to a buried lockbox found under a stump in what used to be church property. But what caught everyone off guard was the tape. Forensics confirmed the blood on the handkerchief was a DNA match to Clara and her son. The ring was hers. She had lost the twin to it when Elijah disappeared. And the tape held Elijah's voice, aged by static but unmistakably him. He sounded tense, careful, like a man watching shadows dance at the edges of the room. "If anything happens to me," Elijah's voice said through the hiss, "Clara, know that I loved you. I loved you with every breath. But something's not right here. Not in this town. Not in this church." He spoke about a ledger, a secret document he had found weeks before his disappearance. He claimed money was being funneled through the church by men in suits who never sat in the pews. He hinted that land deeds were being altered, that someone was forging signatures, and that he had proof. But the ledger was never found. When the tape ended, a chill ran through every person in that small county building. His voice, the calm, direct rhythm of a man of faith, felt more powerful than any court order. Clara sat in silence after hearing it. Her hands, wrinkled and weathered by decades of prayer and grief, didn't shake. Instead, she leaned forward and whispered, "I told you he didn't leave me." But not everyone wanted the truth reopened. Sheriff Joel Mathers, now long retired, refused interviews. His son, now a councilman, called the tape unverified propaganda. A few former church members who had once served on the board refused to comment. And Deacon Samuel Pike? He'd vanished too, moved away in the early 90s and hadn't been seen since. But Clara wasn't done. She marched down to the county office the next morning, media in tow, and demanded the case be reopened. When they hesitated, she handed over every page of her handwritten journals, 29 years of names, timelines, and suspicions. She had even kept a box labeled, "In case they ever listen." Inside were newspaper clippings, letters and names of men Elijah had argued with in the weeks before he disappeared. Reluctantly, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation agreed to open a cold case file. 1 week later, an agent knocked on a door in Macon, Georgia. The man who answered was pale, older, and spoke with the slow drawl of someone who'd spent decades regretting something. Deputy Alan Bristow. He hadn't been seen in Pine Hollow since the fall of '83, and now, dying of cancer, he finally spoke. He admitted that Elijah had confided in him just days before his disappearance, had shown him the ledger, told him that powerful people were hiding something beneath the floorboards of Greater Rock Baptist Church. Alan had believed him, but he was young, terrified, and he'd been warned. "Joel Mathers called me in the middle of the night," Alan rasped. "Told me to shut up. Said if I wanted my mama to keep her house, I'd transfer out. I didn't know what they'd do to Elijah. I swear I didn't." When asked where the ledger went, Alan said he didn't know. "He never gave it to me. Just let me read a few pages. Said he had it hidden somewhere. No one would ever think to look." The agents asked him why he was coming forward now. "I've been haunted by his voice," Alan whispered. "For 29 years, I hear it every night. And now with that tape, maybe I can finally sleep." Back in Pine Hollow, the news broke fast. For the first time in decades, locals began to whisper again. Some angry, some scared, some simply ashamed. People who had sat in Elijah's pews, who had once called him a prophet, a friend, a leader, began remembering the tension that grew in the final months before he disappeared. The strange faces that showed up to church. The construction trucks that moved in and out of the back lot late at night. The sudden renovations to the basement. The funding that seemed to appear from nowhere. And Clara, always waiting, always watching, felt the old ache sharpen into something new. Purpose. She stood on the church steps with Elijah's Bible in one hand and the cassette in the other. Cameras rolled. Reporters jotted notes. And Clara looked straight into the lens. They buried my husband's voice, but they didn't kill it. The wind that swept through Pine Hollow the day the church basement was opened felt different, like the town itself was holding its breath. 2 weeks had passed since the tape emerged, and the town's silence was cracking under its own weight. Agent Yvonne Sutter, sharp and unsentimental, led a forensic team to Greater Rock Baptist Church with a warrant and a question. Why had Elijah Harmon called the basement the one place nobody questions? The floorboards groaned as men in gloves and goggles set up ground-penetrating radar across the sanctuary basement. It was dimly lit, smelled of old carpet and mildew, and still bore faded chalk markings on the floor from Sunday school classes long abandoned. The radar lit up like a Christmas tree. Beneath the northeast corner, just behind the water heater, and under years of dust and drywall, a void appeared, roughly 3 feet high, 10 feet long, walled in on all sides. No documented blueprints mentioned it. No permits existed, just an empty crawl space, sealed behind a thin layer of aging concrete. Clara stood upstairs in the sanctuary, her hand resting gently on the pulpit where Elijah once stood. She didn't flinch when the drills started below. Her eyes stayed fixed forward, lips moving in silent prayer. An hour later, they broke through. Flashlights swept the narrow space. 2 agents crawled in, their knees grinding against dirt and loose nails. In the far corner, tucked beneath a water-damaged tarp, they found it. A rusted strongbox, about the size of a suitcase, dented, locked but brittle. When they opened it, Clara was called down to witness it herself. Inside, a brown leather ledger wrapped in plastic. Several manila envelopes with receipts, bank slips, photocopied property deeds, many of them from the early 1980s. One document had "confidential" stamped across the top. Another bore the seal of the Pine Hollow City Council. But the ledger was the heart of it all. Clara reached out with shaking hands. The cover flaked beneath her fingers like dry skin. She opened it. Elijah's handwriting stared back at her. His penmanship was unmistakable, sharp, slanted, confident. Each line documented something darker than the last. Dozens of pages of names, financial transfers, donation laundering, and illicit land deals involving black families forced off their property through zoning loopholes and forged sales. And worst of all, much of it happened under the name of the church. Church-owned land had been used to funnel money, and Elijah had discovered it. He had listed names, all of them familiar: businessmen, real estate brokers, bank managers, even 2 retired pastors from nearby counties. Clara's hand froze near the back of the ledger. A name stood alone, underlined twice. Judith Harmon, Elijah's sister. She hadn't heard Judith's name in nearly 30 years. Their last conversation had ended with slammed doors and a bitter silence. Judith had always been ambitious, always talking about leverage and using your voice to get paid. She had left Pine Hollow in '79 for Atlanta, calling the town too small, too slow, and too holy. Clara never imagined Elijah had reconnected with her, let alone trusted her. But here she was, in his ledger, with a note scribbled beside her name. Judith brought them to me. She vouched for them. I trusted her. That was my mistake. Agent Sutter stood silently beside Clara. You know her? Clara nodded slowly, swallowing hard. She's his sister. But they parted ways years ago. Do you know how to reach her? No, Clara said, but I imagine you do. The next morning, the GBI tracked Judith Harmon, now Judith Sharp, to a private condominium just outside Atlanta. She worked as a development consultant, drove a luxury SUV, lived alone. She wore elegance like a mass-tailored linen blazer, gold-rimmed glasses, every strand of hair in place. When 2 agents knocked on her door, Judith smiled until they mentioned Elijah, until they said his name. And then she froze. I haven't heard that name in decades, she said softly, voice trembling only for a moment. What's this about? Agent Sutter handed her a photocopy of the ledger page. Your brother wrote this a day before he disappeared. Judith scanned the page. Then she looked up, her expression unreadable. I think I need a lawyer. Back in Pine Hollow, Clara sat at her kitchen table, staring at a photograph she hadn't looked at in years. Elijah and Judith at their father's funeral. Both so young, eyes filled with fire and resentment. The way they stood apart even then said everything. Clara's phone rang. It was Agent Sutter. She's agreed to speak with you present. 2 days later, in a glass-walled interrogation room in Atlanta, Clara and Judith faced each other across a steel table. Neither woman spoke for a long time. Judith was the first to break the silence. You look the same, she said. You don't, Clara replied. You look like someone who spent years pretending her bones weren't breaking. Judith's eyes welled up, but she didn't cry. Instead, she began to talk. Yes, she had introduced Elijah to 2 men, wealthy developers, said they could help grow the church, expand affordable housing, give Elijah power beyond the pulpit. She admitted she took a commission, never told Elijah. When he found out, he threatened to expose her. He told her he couldn't protect her from what would come next. I begged him to walk away, she whispered. Told him it was too big, that these weren't men you expose. Then you left, Clara said, and never came back. Judith nodded. I didn't kill him, she said firmly, but I let him walk into a meeting I knew was dangerous. And the men? Agent Sutter asked. Judith reached into her purse, pulled out a worn card. 3 names, one circled in red. Samuel Pike, former deacon of Greater Rock Baptist, Elijah's right hand. The man who had stood at Clara's side during Elijah's funeral. The man who had moved away suddenly in 1992 without saying goodbye. And the man whose signature appeared next to forge land deeds in the ledger. That night, Clara sat alone again. Elijah's ring around her neck, the ledger open on her lap, and the pages whispering a truth she already knew in her bones. Elijah didn't disappear. He was erased. And now, piece by piece, the erasure was unraveling. The arrest warrant for Samuel Pike was signed on a rainy Thursday morning. For nearly 3 decades, Pike had lived quietly in a small Mississippi town under the alias Don Samuels. He taught Sunday school, grew tomatoes in his backyard. No one in town had a clue who he really was, but his signature in Elijah's ledger and Judith's sworn statement were enough to bring the past roaring back to life. Clara sat in silence as the GBI agents prepared the warrant. Her hands were folded in her lap, but her mind raced with memories of Pike, his soft-spoken prayers, his firm handshake, the way he stood behind Elijah during sermons, as if shielding him from a storm that never came. Except it did, and Samuel Pike was the lightning. By nightfall, GBI agents knocked on the door of a modest ranch-style home outside Jackson, Mississippi. Pike answered in a white t-shirt and suspenders, blinking in confusion at the flash of badges and the sudden weight of his own name spoken out loud for the first time in years. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and conspiracy in the disappearance and presumed murder of Reverend Elijah Harmon. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He simply said, I knew this day was coming, and held out his hands. Back in Pine Hollow, the discovery of Pike's role set off a chain reaction. The local news stations ran Elijah's story on loop. The GBI announced a full-scale probe into all transactions listed in the ledger. Civil rights groups arrived in town. Protesters marched through the square. Old families who had once lost their homes and land under mysterious circumstances came forward with tears and receipts. And Clara? She went home and opened Elijah's journal. Not the ledger, his real journal. The one he kept in their bedroom, in a drawer beneath his socks. She hadn't touched it since 1983. The first entry she read was dated 3 days before he vanished. Clara doesn't know yet. I don't want her to worry, but something's not right with Pike. He keeps asking me to stop pushing, says I'm going to end up like the others. I asked him who he meant. He wouldn't answer. Lord, give me strength. This is bigger than I thought. She closed the book and stared at the ceiling. What others? Meanwhile, Agent Sutter interrogated Pike at a federal holding center. He sat with his arms folded, silent at first. Then she asked him just one question.
Why?
He took a long breath. Elijah was my friend, he said. He was good. Too good. He thought he could beat the system with a sermon and a clipboard. He didn't understand these men didn't care about God. They cared about land, money, control. I tried to warn him. Told him to stay out of it. So you helped them? I didn't help them, Pike snapped. I just didn't stop them. I gave them time. Told them when Elijah would be alone. That's all. I didn't know what they'd do. But you found out, Sutter said. And you stayed quiet for 29 years. Pike looked down at the table. He was my brother in Christ. I thought the guilt would kill me faster than it did. What happened to his body? She asked. That's when Pike hesitated. Then in a low voice he said, he never left the land. The GBI returned to the church property, this time with cadaver dogs and excavation equipment. Clara was there, wrapped in Elijah's old coat, standing in the drizzle like a stone statue. The dogs hid on a spot behind the church, near the edge of the woods 20 yards from where the logger found the box under the stump. An area once used for Sunday school picnics, now overgrown with vines. They dug carefully, peeling away layers of clay and rock. At just over 5 feet deep, the shovel struck something hard. It was a coffin. Homemade, rough. Pine boards nailed together, no markings, no grace. Inside they found what they had feared and hoped for. A skeleton, curled slightly, wrists still bound with rope, a fractured jaw, cloth remnants of a navy blue suit. Dental records confirmed it the next day. Reverend Elijah Harmon had been under their feet for 29 years, buried in the same soil where he once preached love, justice, and warning. The funeral was held 1 week later, a second funeral. But this time, no empty casket. This time the town came out in force. Hundreds lined the pews. News vans rolled in from Atlanta. A gospel choir from Montgomery sang "I'll Fly Away" until there wasn't a dry eye left in the building. Clara walked slowly to the front, leaning on her cane, and laid Elijah's Bible on top of the closed casket. And then she whispered something no one else could hear. You never left me, and I never stopped listening. After the service, Agent Sutter approached her quietly. We've confirmed 3 more names from the ledger, all connected to Pike. There will be arrests. We're not done. Clara looked past her at the church, glowing in the afternoon light. I know, she said, and neither am I. 3 weeks after Elijah Harmon's second funeral, Pine Hollow wasn't the same. The flowers laid at his grave still hadn't wilted. The sanctuary was filled every Sunday, not just with parishioners, but with pilgrims. People drove in from across the state to sit in the pew where Elijah once preached, to lay hands on the pulpit he once thundered from. But it wasn't about mourning anymore. It was about reckoning. The GBI's case widened, testimonies poured in. Land deeds from as far back as the late 60s were reviewed. Families who'd lost their farms under suspicious fires or bank errors were recontacted. Some of them had stopped fighting decades ago. But Elijah's story, his voice from that old cassette, gave them reason to raise their heads again. In total, 12 men were named in the investigation. 4 were already dead, 5 were indicted, and 3, including Samuel Pike, agreed to testify in exchange for reduced sentences. One of them admitted that Elijah had been taken not to be tortured, not to be threatened, but to be silenced quickly. He was calm as keen, the man said in court. Didn't scream, just looked at me and said, truth doesn't die with the man. It walks until it's heard. That line became the phrase etched beneath Elijah Harmon's headstone. Truth walks until it's heard. Clara returned to the church every Sunday, though she no longer sat in the second pew. Now she sat in Elijah's seat. At first it felt wrong, but as the weeks passed, she realized she wasn't filling his place. She was carrying it. His Bible stayed beside her. The tape recorder sat in a small glass case near the altar, and every time the choir sang, she could swear she felt a warmth on her shoulder, like a hand resting there from somewhere beyond time. She spent her weekdays helping investigators connect with families. She spoke at town halls. She even traveled to Atlanta to speak on a civil rights panel about corruption in rural justice systems. Some called her brave. Others called her relentless. Clara didn't care what they called her. She only cared that they kept listening. One morning, about 6 months after the discovery of Elijah's body, Clara received a letter, handwritten, no return address. Inside was a photograph, faded, black and white. It showed Elijah in his 20s, standing beside a boy no older than 10. The boy had a book under one arm and was looking up at Elijah with wide eyes. On the back was a single sentence. He believed in me before I believed in myself. A.B. Clara held the photo for a long time. A.B. Allen Bristow, the deputy who left town in shame, the boy who once sat in the front row, knees swinging off the church pews, memorizing scripture and learning what it meant to be a good man. Clara smiled and placed the photo in Elijah's journal. The church board voted unanimously to rename the sanctuary. It was now the Reverend Elijah Harmon Memorial Chapel. A mural was painted above the altar Elijah, not as a martyr but mid-sermon, hands raised, eyes wide, surrounded by light. Below it were words that Clara had found in one of his journals. If they bury the truth, let the roots carry it upward. Let the trees remember. That same week, Donnie Clayton, the logger who had found the metal box under the tree stump, stood in front of reporters and spoke for the first time. "I'm just a man with a saw," he said humbly, "but I think God let my blade stop where it did for a reason." Lucille Henderson, a 72-year-old woman who had lost her farmland to eminent domain in 1978, walked up to Clara after church one Sunday. "They said I owed back taxes," Lucille whispered, "but my daddy paid every one of them. We just didn't have the right friends." Clara took her hand and said, "Now you do." With the help of pro bono lawyers and the newly energized district attorney, Lucille's land was returned. 3 other families soon followed. The ripples of one man's truth began healing what generations had tried to forget. And then one spring morning, quiet, blue-skied, gentle as a hymn, Clara visited Elijah's grave. She knelt down, knees in the dew-soaked grass, and placed a single white rose beside the headstone. "I have something to tell you," she whispered. "They're listening now." The wind rustled through the trees. "Not just here, but all over. They're listening. They heard you, Elijah. They finally did." She stayed there for a long time, her fingers tracing the engraved letters of his name. Around her, the cemetery was silent. Not with sadness, but with peace. She stood, brushed off her skirt, and turned back toward the church. The bell in the chapel rang out once, echoing across the town. One sound, one truth. One man who refused to stay buried,